Well, the Navy has released dramatic footage of that fire aboard the boat carrying asylum seekers shortly after the fatal explosion which left 5 people dead and many injured. And as doctors from Perth to Darwin and Brisbane work to treat the injured, the government's under increasing pressure over its handling of the situation. It's believed the explosion was caused by the spread of petrol around the boat as those on board tried to avoid being sent back to Indonesia. It's understood the explosion was an accident. The opposition wants the government to come clean with what went on before the boat blew up. And we're joined now in our breakfast studio by the opposition leader, Malcolm Turnbull. Malcolm Turnbull, good morning.
Good morning, Fran.
Malcolm Turnbull, do you think that Australia has a soft immigration policy?
Well, there's no doubt it's been perceived as being soft, and
that was
predicted. Well, it is effectively the same thing. It was predicted as that last year. You'll recall Steve Cook, who's the chief of mission of the International Organisation for Migration in Indonesia, said late last year, and I'm quoting him, "People smugglers have clearly noted that there has been a change in policy and they are testing the envelope." Now, that is an expert in immigration in Indonesia last year commenting on the Rudd government's changes. They were seen as softening our border protection policies, and, as Mr Cook said, the people smugglers have been testing the envelope, and we've had more arrivals since the policies were changed in August than we have had, nearly twice as many, in fact, than we've had in the last 6 years. This is a dramatic increase.
Let's talk perceptions and realities here. Soft in what areas? In your view, what has the Rudd government done wrong here and what should be changed in order to toughen up our policy?
Well, I think we've got to focus on the Rudd government's policy, Fran. I'll come back to where I think we should aim to go ideally.
Where is it wrong?
Well, the problem, where it's wrong is in sending the signals. You were just talking to Michelle about the temporary protection visas, and I think she fairly described them as making the achievement of permanent status in Australia less certain for people who arrive by boat. That was their deliberate purpose as a disincentive. You see, what should be... Let's step back and ask ourselves objectively and coolly and calmly, what should be the objective of our policy? The objective of our policy should be no unauthorised boat arrivals. We don't want them. It's bad in terms of the integrity of our borders, and it also poses enormous danger to life and limb on the high seas, not just of the passengers, but as we've seen also of our naval personnel. So in an ideal world, no boats would come. That's what we want to achieve. So we have to send a message that we are not receptive to unauthorised boat arrivals. Now, the Howard government had achieved that in a number of ways. When, wherever possible, the Navy turned boats around and sent them back to Indonesian territorial waters. You had the Pacific Solution now where people were processed offshore in Manus and Nauru. That, of course, has been superseded by Christmas Island. So you have an offshore processing centre there. You also had that meant that they were processed under the UN rules, not without access to the Australian legal system. So that was a discrimination against unauthorised boat arrivals. Again, a very deliberate disincentive. Christmas Island has been continued, is in operation. But then you had the temporary protection visa regime, which the government abandoned in August because it said it had had no effect. Events since then suggest that they were wrong, I think indicate overwhelmingly that they were wrong, and that was something where the government has unquestionably softened our policy.
As opposition leader, are you calling for the reintroduction or the reinstatement of temporary protection visas?
What I'm calling for, Fran, firstly, is for the government to tell us the facts. We need to know...
No, that's a separate thing. We'll get to that story in a moment. We'll get to the details of this. But in terms of softening, what do you mean? I mean, you and your shadow immigration minister say that the Rudd government softened its policies. When you say it should toughen it up, should it reintroduce TPVs or temporary protection visas?
Certainly, the reintroduction of temporary protection visas should be high on the agenda. But what I'm calling for on the government to do is, firstly, to release all of the information about the incident on the boat. It is unbelievable that the government is stonewalling on this. They have all the facts. All of the naval personnel are back. They've all been interviewed. A number of the asylum seekers have been interviewed. The public are entitled to know what happened. Secondly, it is clear enough that the AFP has given advice to the government about the impact of their softening of our border protection policies on people smuggling. And it appears that that advice is consistent with what most people would say is common sense, and of course what Mr. Cook said, in the remarks I quoted earlier. Now, we need to see that advice. That too should be made public, because it is plain enough that the government's policy is not working. Now, we should have all of those facts on the table, and what we would like to do is sit down with the government and discuss what policies can be changed, how we can have a different approach that will get the result we all seek, which is to have no people smuggling at all. You see, the difficulty is Mr. Rudd's trying to blame this now on push factors. Those push factors have always been there. Afghanistan has been in a sorry state for many years. Iraq, in many respects, in fact, in almost every respect, is a much more peaceful place relative to what it was 4 or 5 years ago.
I don't think the same could be said for Afghanistan or Sri Lanka. And if you're going to quote the IOM, you should also acknowledge the UNHCR says there are more people on the move right now because of push factors. But just before going down that debate, we should stick with what we need to do here in this country. And I want to ask you directly about the cover-up claims in a moment. But just finishing on temporary protection visas, the Immigration Department says on its website that TPVs led to more asylum seekers resorting to people smugglers because it put an end to family reunion. We had more women and children.
Well, that's exactly what they did say, Fran, and the curious thing about that is that during the period of the TPVs, you had hardly any boats arriving.
Not initially. Initially, you had boats arriving with a lot of women and children.
Well, but
tragically, CivX was one of them.
Fran, from between 2002 and the end of 2008, fiscal year 2008, there were around half as many people arriving as have arrived since August last year. So that the fact of the matter is, since the TPVs were abolished by the Rudd government, there has been a dramatic increase. Now, bear this in mind. The people smugglers are a business. They are charging people big money, and they cannot succeed in their business unless they can get people into Australia. So perceptions are very important. And if a government gives the perception that it is softening its policy, and this is what Mr. Cook was saying from the International Office of Migration last year, if they give the perception that they're softening their policy, the people smugglers will seize on that and say to their potential customers, look, Australia's a softer target now, line up, let's get a boat and off we go. And
does the opposition share some responsibility for that? I mean, in terms of perceptions, it's the opposition shouting out to the world that the Labor government's policies are softer, isn't it?
You can't blame us for the Rudd government's policies. We warned that this would send the wrong signal months before they actually made the change. We warned them, we did the right thing. We said, we believe this will send the wrong signal. The government said, no, we know better. It won't make any difference. Now, there has been a dramatic difference. Now, let me just step forward and let's talk about how we might be able to get a better resolution here. There's no doubt that the ideal outcome, at least from our point of view, and I think from most Australians' point of view, is that no boats left Indonesia at all. So clearly we need to ensure that this becomes a criminal offence in Indonesia, which it isn't. So that is one. That's where there is a need for persuasion, cooperation, engagement with the Indonesians.
So you welcome the Prime Minister talking to the President?
Well, of course I welcome him talking to the President of Indonesia, but every Australian Prime Minister has talked regularly to the President of Indonesia. It's an ongoing discussion. We have a very close relationship. But in an ideal world, as much processing as possible would happen in Indonesia. Now that would be the ideal situation, where people who came to Indonesia with the aim of going by boat to Australia instead were detained in Indonesia and were processed appropriately by the UN High Commission on Refugees in Indonesia. Now, of course, you need the Indonesian government's agreement and commitment to that, but that would be the best outcome, because what we want to achieve is no boats leaving Indonesia, and every aspect of policy should be directed towards that.